Welcome, everyone, and thank you for your interest in material culture and the work of GBH Education and our very special guest, Dr. Tiya Miles. I'm Carolyn Jacobs in the GBH Education Department, and I'm calling in from my home in Southern Maine this evening. We are recording. We're using Zoom webinar as our platform. The mic and the camera are reserved for just the presenters. Denise Olson, Director of Marketing in the Education Department, is in the chat. She'll be posting links and monitoring your comments or questions. Make sure the chat is set to everybody so everyone sees your comments, not just the panelists. Many of you posted questions ahead of time. We do hope to go, we're going to stay online until about 8:15 to try to answer as many questions as we can. But we have worked the responses of a lot of your questions into the presentation. So thank you for doing that and giving us some guidance about what you really would like to learn about. We will be sharing the slides, the recording link, and a resource document that includes all of the links of everything you see this evening. And those links to those documents will come out in an email that comes from Zoom at the end of the day tomorrow. And then please feel free to share that with your colleagues. This webinar is the fourth in a series around the new U.S. History collection on PBS Learning Media, which you will be hearing much more about later on in the session. Both the webinar series and the collection are generously supported by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Thank you, CPB, very much. We are hosted by GBH Boston, which is Boston's PBS station and the producer of many of the iconic series that you see on your local stations. American Experience and Frontline being examples that are of particular interest to social studies teachers. In the education department at GBH, we research and develop at no cost and make available at no cost educational content and services for equitable learning for all ages. We're also hosted this evening by PBS Learning Media. If you're not already familiar with it, please check it out, visit the site, begin to explore the thousands of resources, and in particular, the new U.S. History collection. This is a screenshot of the homepage. If you just put U.S. History in the search bar, you will get right to the collection that we are very proud of and that you will learn more about this evening. Okay. Let's see. The entire series of the webinar, this is the fourth in a series of four, has been a collaboration with the National Council for the Social Studies. And we're very pleased to have Ashante Horton with us tonight from NCSS, and she has a couple of words of welcome for you.
Hi, everyone. So I put my little welcome in the chat. We're so happy to have you all here this evening. And we are so thrilled with our collaboration with WGBH. And want to say a special thank you to Carolyn for always pulling it all together. So you guys are going to get a lot out of this evening, as you do from the last few webinars that we've had. And we're looking forward to doing more.
Thank you, Ashante. It's great. We love NCSS. And you'll hear more about the conference at the end of the program. All right, this is our stellar social studies team, and they are all presenters this evening, led by Sue Wilkins, who's the director of the team that you see here. All three of these women have extensive classroom experience, and in fact, Alicia Butler in the center is a full-time DC. She's a full-time African-American studies teacher in DC. And we're thrilled to have her with us for part of her busy life. And our very special guest this evening is Dr. Tiya Miles. She is the author of 6 books. Her most recent book, All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley's Sack, Black Family Keepsake. Excuse me, I'm kind of feel like I'm losing my voice. She was awarded the National Book Award for Nonfiction and was an inspiration for this webinar. Dr. Miles was on the faculty of University of Michigan for 16 years, and she is currently the Michael Garvey Professor of History and Radcliffe Alumni Professor at Harvard University. And it has been a pleasure getting to know Dr. Miles a little bit and working with her, and you are in for a treat when you hear from her.
All right, in today's webinar.
No, 1 second. I'm sorry. We jumped ahead. So the plan for this evening, Alicia is very soon going to talk a little bit about the warm-up activity and then give us some context for this evening, followed by Dr. Miles has a few introductory slides to show, and then a conversation with Alicia. Then Sue will come on and introduce you to the new U.S. History collection that I mentioned on PBS Learning Media. And then the entire social studies team has some resources and strategies to share with you about using material culture. And again, we'll stay online until 8:15 and hopefully have some time to answer your questions. Okay, Alicia, take it away.
Thank you. I'm so excited. I just jumped right in there. All right. Once again, guys, welcome. Thank you so much for logging on. In today's webinar, we will answer the following essential question. How can we integrate the study of artifacts into our lessons to highlight the stories and experiences of unheard groups in history and equip students with the skills to become the history keepers of their communities? Specifically, teachers will better understand what material culture is and why it is a valuable asset in the classroom. They'll learn how artifacts can be used in history to reveal new and untold stories, and explore resources and activities to use in the history classroom to incorporate the analysis of artifacts. Next slide. Now, while we waited for the webinar to begin, we displayed a series of historical images and asked several questions relating to their origins and uses. All of the objects were items belonging to the panelists that held a special or unique history and backstory. For example, item number 1 was mine. It's the 1970s ceramic set and was used for containing flour and spices. It shows how food was stored and reflects the aesthetic styles of the era, and was one of the only items that my great-grandmother, who was once a sharecropper, was able to save up to pass on to my mother as a wedding gift. Item 2 is a rug beater, an 8-pound iron, and was used for housekeeping. It shows how time-consuming and physically demanding housework was. And then item 3 is a photograph and was used for an official portrait for Major Zoltan. I'm gonna decimate this name, which I apologize. All right, Lindsay, you want to help me out here?
Yeah, I'll jump on. Mihalowicz.
Thank you, Mihalowicz. It shows how he served Austria-Hungary during World War I. Next slide. Now, although all the objects were historic, not all were considered historic artifacts. Some were considered heirlooms. An artifact, like object number 1, is defined as an object made by a human being and is an item of cultural or historical interest. Object number 2 falls along the line of an heirloom. It's a valuable object that has belonged to a family over generations. Now, oftentimes an object can be both an artifact and an heirloom, like object number 3. Material culture is a study of both heirlooms and artifacts. I would like to pose a question for you all to ponder, as you're participating in the webinar. Why do you think it's important to make room in our curriculum for the study of both heirlooms and artifacts? And while you think about it, please feel free to place your answers in the chat. Next slide. Material culture is the physical evidence of human experience, and it includes the vast array of objects that people use or have used in their everyday lives. Material culture transcends just a simple study of an object's utility, and it reveals a deeper understanding of the time period and the people who actually made it. Now, historians tend to focus on artifacts. Although heirlooms are important for family history, this webinar will focus specifically on the discussion of the use of artifacts in our classroom. You know, artifacts are powerful. For example, they can serve as a different window into the past. They could be a voice for the unheard and the unrecognized groups in the communities in history. They could represent a tangible history that students can actually touch and prove that history is not dead. They can connect worlds and communities without clear and documented histories. And more importantly, it permits students to discover history for themselves. Next slide. But why are we here today? Now, we've had three different webinars. This is our last one, all right? Why of all topics would we have chosen material culture? And it really centers on the fact that I came across a 2017 article that I found really, really interesting, but also really accurate, for it summarized my encounters in the classroom. A Washington Post article found that the number of students that are actually majoring in history has been declining since 1982. The article reviewed a book entitled Rebooting Social Studies, Strategies for Reimagining History Classes by Greg Milo. And Milo found that students dislike history classes because they focus on memorization. They fall short on motivating students. They stress date regurgitation versus actual problem solving. And they, more importantly, which I really love, fail to make students feel a part of history. And they lack opportunities for students to actually take action. Next slide. So now we'd like to ask you, which of the following is the primary reason students in your classroom dislike history? You could just throw the letter next to the statement in the chat. Do you find that in your own classroom that students oftentimes, are kind of like, they're not really feeling it, not really liking history because they focus on memorization? Do your students have like an aversion for history because it falls short of motivating students? Whoa, that you all are quick to put your answers in the chat. So I'm assuming that we're hitting a nerve here. You all can identify. And what's interesting is that when I look in the chat, we're all over the place, right? I got a lot of D's. History students just aren't feeling a part of history. I got some A's, all right? It focuses way too much on memorization. Definitely seeing the presence of a lot of E's here where students lack opportunities for student action. And I love Annie. Annie says, look, F, all of the above. And I actually would agree with Annie. I'm experiencing that too, all of the above. I think in my classrooms, I feel that there are probably two issues. My students really want to do something, all right? So they're really kind of like along the E. Once they find out about history, it's like, all right, was it just dead, or can we actually work towards fixing it or making our mark, and that they fail to, feel like they're a part of history. Thank you all so much for participating. I love it. So the analysis of artifacts can help with these problems, right? It can help our students realize that history is not dead, that history is tangible, it surrounds them. And what I love too is that it can help our students to realize that a lot of those overlooked family possessions are windows into their history, particularly for communities facing obstacles to written historical records. And it really helps our students to understand that they can be the keepers of history. Next slide. So this was the fun part. We invited you to submit images and stories of artifacts, and here are some wonderful examples. Thank you to Lynn Marche Frazier, if you are all out there, and Larry Moore for sending these. If either of you are on the webinar, please feel free to comment further in the chat. Lynn Marche Frazier, she's an artist and director of education of the Museum of American History in Boston and Nantucket, creates and uses artifacts to support teachers in teaching the tough stuff of US history. The two images on the left tell stories informed by bios and artifacts of the African-American and Indigenous experience in the 18th and 19th century. The first is from the Quilted Chronicles collection and is of Robert Smalls, 1862 to 1915, born enslaved, ship captain, congressman for South Carolina, and US congressman. Wow. The second is from Beadwork Stories, which is a collection and honors the indigenous ancient reference to North America as Turtle Island, and the simultaneous reference of the West African symbol to celebrate the nature of the turtle. This was informed by the research into fiber and bead language patterns. Next, we have two related artifacts submitted by Larry Moore, both different commemorative items created about the battleship Maine incident, Spanish-American War, glass candy container and a commemorative spoon, which has an image of the ship, and the inscription U.S. Battleship Maine, blown up in Havana Harbor, February 15th, 1898. The family lore is that a soldier sent them to Larry's grandmother, who would have been 8 years old at the time. It is amazing, I agree. We know today of the connections of the Maine incident to yellow journalism and America's imperialistic machinations at the time. The next slide. The first is a family classroom quilt. I love it. Done by 4th and 5th graders using printable fabric. Amazing. A community elder was invited to the classroom for a month to put the quilt together, right with the sewing machine and fabrics all around. Robin Pizzo has generously shared many photos of the individual squares. She says that 30 years later, former students still seek her out to tell her how impactful the project was. I love it. The second is a food inventory submitted by Cameron Sheets. Her husband's grandfather worked in food services at the University of Georgia for decades. He has stacks of these notebooks with this intricate handwritten inventory of food items purchased by the university. Not only are these notebooks a record of pricing and foodways eating habits, but they're also a record of his service. He was never given retirement benefits, while his white counterparts and his children did not get tuition remission as the children of his white counterparts did, despite these years of service. Amazing. Thank you so much. Now, another example of the power of artifacts was actually the inspiration for this webinar. In 2019, I took my students to the African American History Museum. As the students were away on their scavenger hunt, I came across an 1850s sack and a glass case. And on the sack was sewn, "My great-grandmother Rose, mother of Ashley, gave her the sack when she was sold at the age of 9 in South Carolina." It had a tattered dress, 3 handfuls of pecans, a braid of Rose's hair, and it told her it would fill my love always. She never saw her again. Ashley is my great-grandmother, Ruth Middleton, 1921. All this was sewn on the sack. Now, as I was reading this, I was still a fairly new mother with a toddler at home, and I literally began to cry. I had never been as touched by an artifact before like I had that day. I don't know if it was the hormones or the hormones in combination to the sack and what was written there. But I know that I wanted to know as much as I could about the story behind the sack, as well as the history in which it was centered. And that's why I'm so excited to begin our conversation with the Dr. Tiya Miles, the scholar who helped to piece together the history and the story behind Ashley's sack. Welcome, Dr. Miles.
Thank you so much, Alicia, and please call me Tiya. It is really a treat to be here with you all this evening to talk about teaching and material culture and how we can engage our students in the past, help them to see that there really are live connections between the days that we move through in the present and the days that our ancestors moved through in the past. You know, I think I want to share a secret with you, given what Alicia said in her introductory remarks. And oh my goodness, Alicia is clearly an amazing teacher. That secret is that I did not enjoy history very much at all when I was a student. I recall in high school feeling that history, see in the chat, what? Yeah, it's a secret. Shh. I recall in high school feeling that history was dry, that it didn't really have to do with me. And quite frankly, the classroom environment that I was in was one in which I was the only Black student. And in that context, I felt that sense of stigma when the topic turned to slavery. And so I really distanced myself from history. And it wasn't until graduate school when I realized that the stories my grandmother had been telling me my whole life about what it had been like for her to move up north from Mississippi to Ohio with her children and to start a new life. And I saw that that was actually history. That I decided, oh, I can do this. This is meaningful. This matters. I understand this. There was a way for me to come in. And the stories that she told were always accompanied by things things that she had in her home that her family had once had in Mississippi, such as an egg basket that I still have in my home today. So I think this really is a crucial issue, encouraging our students to see their connections to the past, to see that these episodes in the history of the community, the nation, the world are truly relevant to them. And I think material culture is a wonderfully effective way of doing that. So now I'm going to share my screen. Bear with me for one moment, please. Oops, I'm actually having trouble pulling it up. Carolyn, if I struggle for another moment, I'm going to ask you to pull it up for me.
Okay,
I'm not seeing it on my desktop.
okay.
One sec, you all. I'm going to give it one more try.
What you could do, Tiya, is stop sharing and let me share, and I have it pulled up for you.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
I don't think I'm sharing yet. I don't think I'm sharing yet, Carolyn.
You're not sharing? Okay,
No.
okay. All right, well, let's make sure I am. Okay, can you see that?
I can see it. Thank you for having that handy.
Welcome.
Well, if I can manage it toward the end, I'll show you another slide that's only on my computer. But for now, I'm just grateful that Carolyn had that in her deck. So this is true about the sharing options. So what you're looking at is the back of the artifact that Alicia was describing. And Alicia said that she didn't know if it was the hormones or what it was that led her to cry when she saw this sack. You know, I can tell her and all of you, oh, you're going to see more in just a second, Denise. I can tell her and tell all of you that it certainly was not just a transitory moment. So many people see this item and start to cry because it is absolutely compelling. It's just heart-stopping, the fullness of this artifact. But looking at it right now, as some of your comments in the chat are indicating, really doesn't seem to tell us much. Doesn't seem to tell us much. But in fact, even when we look at the back of this object, we can begin to extract information from it. We can get the sense that it is aged. We can see that it is worn. We can even see that there are small pieces of the fabric that have been torn, that have been frayed perhaps, and that have been patched over time. You see those little almost circular and square shapes, the ripples around them? Those indicate that this object has been cared for. We can already begin to understand something about the people who used this object in the past. They cared about the item. Carolyn, could you advance the slide, please? Thank you. So now we see the front. And this is the inscription that brought Alicia to tears and brings so many to tears that she read aloud. This is an embroidered cotton textile. And we know that it was sewn in the 1920s. We see the signature at the bottom, Ruth Middleton. We see the date, 1921. We know that she started it at some point in that year or before that year. And this item tells us the very saddening story of the separation of an enslaved mother and her child. It is a heartbreaking story, but it is also an uplifting story in that we see the depth with which the mother Rose cared for her daughter Ashley. We see it in the language of the embroidery, a story passed down across the generations. And we see it in that biggest word right there on the item, which is love, written in the single red line of thread right there in the middle. And so in this single object, we have so many elements and features and facets and nuances that we can open up to try to understand what it might have been like to be an enslaved mother, what it might have been like to be an enslaved child. What were the kinds of things that enslaved families had at their disposal? What were the ways that enslaved parents, mothers, may have been thinking about their lives? How did it occur to them that they might be able to try to keep their children safe, even in the face of impending doom and disaster, which was sale? We can get these things and more just from this object. You can advance the slide, please, Carolyn. Thank you. So I saw someone wrote in the chat that they thought it would be a lot brighter. This is one of the ways that we can really begin to date the sack and get the sense that it has changed over time. That the thread is rather pale, the colors are rather pale, they have faded, the entire textile has faded. And that aspect of the material culture object is, again, information for us as researchers and as teachers. I want to share with you some of the very first thoughts that curators at the Middleton Place Foundation down in Charleston, South Carolina, were able to get down onto the page about this object. This is when they had first received it by way of a donation, which Alicia will talk more about later in our conversation. And they were trying to understand, the curators, what this thing even was. Because now this sack has been circulating in various news stories. It's been in museums. It's been in my book. It's been in articles. So it may be familiar to some of us in this virtual space. But when this sack was recovered in the early 2000s and donated to Middleton Place Foundation, it was new. And the curators had the really profound and also exciting job of trying to begin to make sense of the thing. And here is what they did first. They just tried to observe, take note, understand what are the features that make up this material object. And here's what they drafted. Charleston, South Carolina, circa 1850 sack, 1921 needlework. Plain weave cotton ground, cotton block stitch fabrication, 3-strand cotton embroidery floss, back stitch embroidery. Height, 29 and 11 by 16. Width, 15 and 3/4 inches. I'm still reading from the curator's early work here. Sacks made of plain weave cotton, like this example, were manufactured for flour, seeds, and other food staples beginning in the late 1840s with the invention of the industrial sewing machine. Unlike stitching by hand, the double locking chain stitch produced by the machine made a seam strong enough to hold heavy contents. The numerous worn spots had been reinforced with rectangles of cloth carefully hand sewn in place. So what they did was try to understand what they were looking at and where it might have been made and what it might have been made of, which helps to begin to open and answer questions about the historical actors who may have used this item. After trying to determine what the sack was made of and where it might have been produced, the curator set about trying to identify who the people were who are described on the sack. And that, as you can imagine, was a much more challenging, much more long-term process. They were not able to come to a determination about that, and other scholars stepped in. Mark Auslander is one of those. He is an anthropologist and a former museum director who's now in the Boston area. And I'm another one of those people. I am a scholar of histories of African America, women's histories, Native American histories, Southern histories. And with various people putting their minds to the problem, we have been able to determine with something like 98% accuracy who these people are who are actually named on the sack. If you could advance it, please, Carolyn. Thank you. It turns out that this sack, with its beautiful and wrenching story about Ruth's great-grandmother, Rose, who packed this sack for Ashley when she was sold at age 9 in South Carolina, is an incredibly rare and perhaps one-of-a-kind object. To this date, there has been nothing found that is quite like it, that contains a family story with this degree of detail, that has been sewn in an artistic fashion on the original object. It is quite special, and it has opened up many ways of thinking about and understanding the past. One of the things that I think is central that we can glean from this material culture artifact is that Black women, even facing the extremities of enslavement, did the best they could to take care of their families and children. And they did this by attending to material needs, by collecting material items. And the items they collected, in many cases, are now our artifacts. They are now items of historical or archaeological or historical importance that help us to understand the complexity of the past. So what I'd like to do now, thank you, Carolyn, look, there it is to show you another image. And this is an image of a personal Bible, which is owned by a former graduate student, now a doctor out there doing her scholarship. And it's a Bible in which her family had collected braids of hair and various notations and cards having to do with especially funerals in their family. The person who owns this Bible brought it to me to ask me if I could help her to understand its significance. And I then went to one of the curators of the exhibit in which Ashley's sack had been on display. The curator told me that the museum in DC, the Smithsonian African American Museum, has actually quite a number of Bibles. And so while this Bible, and it's with its beautiful moving hair clippings and all the little pieces of ephemera inside, is incredibly special to the researcher who brought it to share it with me and to her family, it's actually not the kind of item that at this time needs to have a place in the museum from the perspective of the curators. And I think this just sheds a light on what Alicia was saying about all material culture is enlightening. We can learn from all of it. We want to teach our students, I think, to learn from all of it. But not every item has the same kind of value in every context. And part of the work of thinking about material culture, studying with it, teaching it, is making those decisions about value, which has to do in large part with comparison and with context and with time. So I think I will stop there so that we can move into our conversation. Thanks, you all.
Awesome. Wow, what amazing images. Historians often rely on enslavers' descriptions of enslaved people. So how did that impact or complicate the fact that you were attempting to reconstruct the stories of Black women from different generations who were transferred to different locations?
Well, I'm going to sort of enter that question sideways and say, what you said is exactly on point. The records that exist about enslaved people are few and far between. They are withholding when it comes to individualized information. They are disturbing because of the ways in which they dehumanize formerly enslaved people. And this is precisely why an object like Ashley Sack is so valuable, because it is an item which is a record of slavery that was not produced by those who owned others as slaves. It is an item that can be viewed, to my mind, as an historical document. It can be viewed as a primary source that can tell us about the experience of enslavement from the perspective of the enslaved. Because when we think about why it is that enslavers were keeping records, we can see that it was to further their enterprise. That kind of record keeping is not built to care about enslaved people. It's not built to shed light on their interior lives or to indicate the depth of love and emotion they would have felt for one another. That's not what these records were for. These records were for keeping people in bondage and for deriving profit out of their exploited labor and out of their knowledge and out of their suffering. Those kinds of records will always be not only very difficult to work with, but also upsetting to work with, maddening to work with. In the arena of material culture, we can find a whole other terrain of objects. And here I wanted to sneak in a connection to a comment I made earlier when I said that, back in my classes in high school, I always felt like, all the eyes turned toward me when we talked about slavery. And it was my imagination. The eyes did turn towards me back then, back in the 1980s. And I did feel a sense of shame. And I think it's important to say that out loud because this is real. The emotions that children bring into the classroom, and these emotions can really stifle their ability to be open and to want to learn. I remember feeling like I just wanted to put my head down. I didn't want to look up in those contexts. But that's partly because we were learning about the history of slavery through the eyes of enslavers and through documents about war, as opposed to from the perspective of the enslaved. I can only imagine what I would have been feeling if I had read something like this sewn inscription on a sack in high school, and how I would have felt sad, of course, and heartbroken, of course, but also proud of what Rose did, proud of what she did for her daughter, proud of the fact that Ashley made it. And we know she made it because Ashley was Ruth's grandmother. And Ruth tells us that on the sack. So I think we need to use all the sources at our disposal, Alicia. But I feel that must include sources that are viewed sometimes as less traditional, including material culture sources.
Well, speaking of focusing on the sources, another question we have is that even with all the research you were able to successfully do, which was amazing, to answer the many questions about Ashley Sack and the people associated with it, there remain some missing links in the story that had to be filled in with general knowledge of the era and conjecture. How do we explain the obstacles, particularly when reconstructing the history of many oppressed and marginalized groups in American history to our students, without making them feel that they can't trust the reliability of any new or existing research?
Mhm. Such a great question. And I think the answer, or my answer to it, connects us back to the info that you put up on a slide early on in this webinar about students not really connecting with history and the reasons why. The reasons that maybe they felt that it was too much memorization, too dry, nothing to do, no problems to solve. But guess what? That's the opposite of what history actually is. That's the opposite of what history is. History is all problem solving. It's all problem solving. History really is a process of detective work. And I think that's partly why I came around to recognizing that this is something that I could really love and really throw myself into, because I was a longtime mystery reader. And in fact, I used to watch Murder, She Wrote with my grandmother all the time. So Angela Lansbury's passing made me think of my grandmother, my dear grandmother. And so history really is that same kind of process where we have questions. We have questions about what happened in the past. We don't know the answers to those questions. And we will never have a complete picture because we're not there. The past is gone. Our job is to find the clues, find the sources, find the evidence that can help us to reconstruct as best as we can the events of the past. If students think that history is just a flat, static statement of this is what happened, and by the way, that statement is just full of a certain name and a certain date, of course they're gonna rather do something else. But if instead we tell them history is a search, it's a quest, it's a mystery. Our job is to use all of our brain power and our collaborative faculties of working together to find those clues, to piece together a picture. That picture will always only be a reconstruction. But we can come as near as we can to as accurate a reconstruction as we can muster of the past. And those are those eureka moments where you feel, oh, I've got it, I see something here.
Love it. You explained the difference between an heirloom and an artifact. Can you explain why Ashley Sack falls into the artifact category? And was there ever a time in your research where others tried to argue that it was an heirloom not worthy of additional study?
Well, I think Ashley Sack falls into both categories. And as your comments pointed out, so importantly, these categories are blurry around the edges. They fade into each other. And how an item might be classified would change over time, would change with context, would change with the person who is actually making that call and making that decision. Ashley's sack, from the time that it was rediscovered in the early 2000s, has been viewed as something special, something of historical or cultural import. And so therefore it has been viewed as an artifact that has been put on display. It's also an heirloom though. For generations, this particular family, and in fact, a line of women in this family passed down the sack. And that to me is utterly astonishing and wonderful and beautiful. These women carried this sack over decades, across a century, from the South to the North. It was their heirloom. And the fact that they ended up somehow losing it over time is actually, that should give us pause. I mean, that there is a loss there that I think that hopefully we'll talk about a little bit later. But it was an heirloom at the time that they were passing it down, and it was a cherished heirloom. This takes us back to the stitches that I pointed out at the beginning, to the repairs. It is also an artifact. And, I think that while people, scholars, curators, and museum goers recognized early on that it was an artifact, what was missing in the chain for Ashley's sack was the recognition that it was an heirloom. That's what was missing early on, because um, the sack was at first thought to be just nothing but an old rag. That was the gap. That was the moment when there was a real lack of recognition of the value of this item, when it was no longer in the care of the family and no longer seen as an heirloom, something that was meaningful to those women.
I'd like to just pause for a second and bring attention to the items that were inside the sack. Could you describe the importance of each of the items that were reportedly placed in Ashley's sack in relation to slave culture? And are any of those connections still important in today's Black American culture?
They're all still important. And that's one of the reasons why working with material culture can be so meaningful to everybody today, to all of us, teachers and students alike, because these items help us to connect those dots and to recognize those threads. So when the sack was found or rediscovered, it was empty. So none of the items listed on the sack were still in it. Another loss. I think through in the book the possibilities of how Ashley might have used the items, when Ashley might have used the items. And I speculate that I bet the braid of hair probably lasted the longest, because it was the thing in the sack that really was a memento, really was a way that Ashley could have remembered Rose, and I think Rose probably would have intended it as such. And it was the one item that wasn't utilitarian. I think Ashley would have probably used the utilitarian items right away. And let me just go over again what was in the sack to refresh our memory. There was a tattered dress, and there was a braid of Rose's hair. There were 3 handfuls of pecans. And let's also mention that there was love, because the inscription says that love was packed into the sack. So love may not have been a material item in the sack, but I would argue that love was materialized, made real, concretized in Ashley's life because of the sack. So, we could talk, for many minutes and many hours about each item, because each item is so rich and so evocative about its meaning for the past and the present. But I'll just offer a few thoughts about them now to kind of continue to get us thinking about what material culture items, what these artifacts can help us to understand. So we know that a dress was packed into the sack, and that seems like it makes sense, right? That a mother would want to clothe her child. And on some level, packing an item of clothing could be just that basic. But once we look at the various layers of context in the 1850s, in South Carolina, in the lives of enslaved women and enslaved girls, we see that a dress is so much more than that. And this is partly because enslaved girls and women did not have the same kind of legal right or social cultural right to modesty or to bodily protection that was reserved for white women, and especially for middle class and elite white women. And an item of clothing is actually a way to maintain your modesty and a way to protect your body from onlookers. And so a dress is, of course, a necessary item, but it is also a way that an enslaved girl or woman could try to shield herself, try to cover herself, try to protect her modesty in the context of her enslavement. Dresses and various other articles of clothing were also important to enslaved people as ways that they showed their care for their own bodies, for their own selves, and for one another. It was very interesting for me in doing research for the book to find out that when enslaved people were able to get a little bit of money through doing, side jobs or getting paid for extra work, or when they were able to steal items, which some people did because they were not being clothed to the degree that was required for their physical comfort, they tended to take items of clothing. They tended to try to get their hands on pieces that would give them a sense of pride and self-worth and individuality, and would differentiate them from the standard, ration clothing made of a very uncomfortable, stiff, and unattractive fabric that was known generally as, quote, Negro cloth at the time. Enslaved people recognized that dress, that apparel, was actually a way to indicate status. It was a way to mark caste. I touched on the braid a little bit as a memento, and pecans were, it turns out, a very important luxury food item, very difficult for people to get their hands on. And so for Rose to have been able to access pecans indicates something about her, such as that she probably was a cook in the household of the people who owned her.
Wow, we can just go on and on talking about this just amazing artifact and heirloom. And Tiya, we appreciate so much just giving your insight into just the world of material culture and just the story and all your efforts behind uncovering the history behind this just amazing and very touching artifact. Thank you so much. We so appreciate just everything that you were able to enlighten us with. At this point, we are going to move it over to Sue, and she's going to tie in our new history collection with how we can help you teach material culture in your classroom. Thank you so much, Tiya.
Thanks, Alicia.
Yes, thank you so much. That's going to be a hard act to follow, but I am actually so excited to share with everybody our new U.S. history collection. And let me just pull up my screen and slides to share with you all. I hope you can see that now. So if you haven't seen the new U.S. history collection that's available on PBS Learning Media, I invite you to visit and explore. It is filled with about 400 free supplemental digital resources that cover the scope and sequence of U.S. history. Many of the resources focus on core topics in U.S. history, but many also highlight the multiple and often conflicting views and interpretations of historical events that broaden and complicate students' understanding of the past, which I think is a good thing. You can browse the resources by one of 16 eras that you see here, or by one of 9 different historical thinking skills, ranging from analyzing primary sources to developing civic understanding. Like this resource on Roosevelt and the Lend-Lease Act, each resource centers on a piece of media, in this case, a video, which is an excerpt from an American Experience film. Most of the video clips range between 3 and 6 minutes in length and all aligned to curriculum standards. We've created new support materials to facilitate use of the resource in the classroom and to provide a consistent user experience. And I invite you to and encourage you to look through these. But every resource in the collection has teaching tips for teachers, and that explains the media's purpose and provides suggestions for how to integrate it into your lesson plan. Every resource has discussion questions for students. These are 3 to 5 higher order critical thinking questions that can be assigned during class or as a homework assignment. This resource also has a student background reading, and this is the background reading, and at least 25% of the collection's resources will have readings. And they provide additional historical context for the media topic. Oh, let me get rid of that. And this resource also has an independent student activity, and at least 50% of the resources will have brand new activities like this, each of which focuses on one historical thinking skill that applies to that media. We have also created entirely new resources: interactive lessons, interactive images, and interactive timelines. So this is an interactive lesson. This is one of many new lessons created for the collection. An interactive lesson is a student-facing, self-paced, sequential lesson that puts students at the center of the learning experience and frees you up to provide individual support as needed. Students can move at their own pace and can complete all of their work in the lesson platform. So you can see here, there are questions and places for them to put their answers. And I think you can also see that these are filled with great images, videos, charts, graphs, and maps. And each lesson is focused around an essential or guiding question, so there's clear purpose to the work that students are asked to do. Get that out of the way. Okay, so like the interactive lesson, interactive images like this one put students at the center of the learning experience, but they're designed to be more exploratory. And we'll go into this. Perhaps you're familiar with this image, but in this resource, students not only practice image analysis, but they learn about three groups of people who typically are not mentioned when studying the Revolutionary War: Black Americans, women, and Native Americans. And by clicking into a hotspot, students can learn more about each particular group. And this is one example of what we mean by multiple perspectives. And in many ways, interactive timelines like this one are similar to interactive images. The emphasis is on the student and on exploration. And this timeline covers a very typical topic in a U.S. history survey course, often though the content is covered by lecture, which can be dull, or group work, which can be very time-consuming. This timeline gets students to think about the perplexing historical question of why the nation's longstanding ability to compromise fell apart during the 1850s and led to the Civil War. And it does so in an efficient and engaging way with lots of short videos, historic maps, and images. And all of our interactives come with teaching tips, discussion questions, and a student activity. So that's a brief overview of the U.S. History Collection, and I really do encourage you to take some time to investigate for yourself. I'm going to transition now and let you know that the U.S. History Collection also has a variety of resources that can help you bring artifact analysis and material culture into your history classroom. And this can be especially helpful if you don't have access to artifacts for classroom use. So this image comes from an artifact gallery that features examples of how young American children were affected by World War II, the first total war in U.S. history. And I'm just going to focus on the objects here, the artifacts here that deal with American children for tonight's purpose. So this image here is a book for young American children dealing with what they could do to help Uncle Sam. They're advised to stay healthy, buy war stamps, care for gardens, be cheerful, and more. This is a poster for a 1943 anti-Nazi propaganda film starring Disney's Donald Duck. This is a Hitler piggy bank for children to save their money, with the etching in the top, "Make him squeal, save for victory." And I think, though, much more common would have been these tin dime register banks. These were very common during World War II. Children would put dimes in them, and you could not take the dimes out until you had deposited $5.40 worth of dimes. Only then would the bank open. You could then take those dimes to buy war stamps. You'd fill up your victory book with your war stamps, and then you would then use this to eventually buy a war bond. And this is just a great way to show your students how involved children were in the total war effort. All right, and then just keeping along with that theme, this image is available in a different artifact gallery, and I'm just going to blow it up for you here. This shows a form that one needed to fill out and get stamped by the War Rationing Board, the Office of Price Administration, and that's what you see in the lower left-hand corner there. And I think on one level, this is sort of a great discovery activity for students. They could look at this image and you could ask them, so, where does this person live? Where does this person want to travel? What is the purpose of this form? On another level, though, I think it can be used to discuss the expansion of the federal government's powers during the war, not just for industry and the economy, which I think is what textbooks tend to focus on, but this is government control of this woman who wants to take a trip from Newton, Massachusetts to Algonquin, Maine. And this is to verify that she has enough gas ration coupons to make the round trip, as it says here, by the shortest and most direct route. I think that's just amazing. All right, we also have videos, I think, that could be used to teach material culture. This video comes from the American Experience film, Riveted, The History of Jeans. And I think it's a great example of how videos can be used to teach material culture. So I think you could begin class with something as ordinary as denim or blue jeans and ask your students, what do they know about, what are jeans made of? What makes them blue? When do they think denim was first, invented? And then the two short videos here in this resource answer many of those questions. Students might be surprised to know that denim dates back to colonial America and was originally referred to as Negro cloth, a phrase that shows up in many runaway slave ads. And the process of dyeing cloth blue with indigo relied on the expertise of enslaved Africans who brought this knowledge with them to the colonies. And the last resource I'm going to share with you is a little different. I think technology is also an example of material culture and getting students to think about how very ordinary, even outdated inventions by today's standards, such as the telephone, the telegraph, the light bulb, how they actually revolutionize society and the way people lived is another way to use material culture to explore the past. So those are just a few ideas and suggestions. And now I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Lindsay.
Thank you so much, Sue. I really appreciate it. As Sue has already touched upon, clothing really offers so many different ways to bring material culture into the classroom. So from thinking about the way that clothing is manufactured, who is actually making that clothing, to who is wearing the clothing, and how clothing is used to mark wealth, social status, or group belonging. Clothing, again, marks this really easy entry point that I think students can really grab onto when you want to bring material culture into the classroom in this very tangible way. So tonight, I want to quickly show you two different but ready for classroom use digital resources on PBS Learning Media in our U.S. History collection for you to really talk about as a way to use clothing to dive into material culture and history. So clothing has offered so many different windows into great historical understanding, and I think fashion is also a really great topic for students to grasp. So the first resource that I wanted to show you tonight, Politics and Fashion, or rather Fashion and Politics, comes from our Why It Matters series, which is aimed at directly connecting the past to the present. So the video in this piece of the collection really is going to focus on the way that fashion has been used to represent the political views of different groups. So particular attention is going to be paid to how the suffragists wore white to further their cause and how the legacy of wearing white is still carried on by female politicians today. So a couple things that I want to draw your attention to in this collection. The first, as you can see on the screen, you can click on to open a background reading. I also have this open if it doesn't pop up. Give me 1 second. So here's our student background reading. These student background readings are short historical readings. They're typically about 1 to 2 pages in length, and they're written at a 9th grade reading level approximately. So opening with an essential question, we want students to consider when they're looking at this, why has wearing white clothing become a symbol for women in politics. The student background reading also brings in these multiple perspectives, exploring the ways in which Black suffragists were excluded from the mainstream suffrage movement, yet still embraced the wearing of white as a powerful symbol of the movement. So we have Congresswoman and presidential candidate Shirley Chisholm continuing the legacy. She has a big feature here. I also love this photograph of her. As the first Black woman elected to Congress, Chisholm advocated for an anti-poverty legislation and educational reform, frequently doing so while wearing white. And this reading, as well as the actual video, ends with how modern politicians frequently wear white today as a means to carry on that fight for equality and to also honor those women who fought for suffrage over 100 years ago. But clothing as material culture can take on more nuanced meanings, particularly as we have students consider the complex social and economic structures in which these materials were created. So let's take for a moment this shirtwaist into consideration. The shirtwaist was a simple button-down blouse that by the early 20th century received a little bit of a makeover, added some lace, added some frills, and then made it the it shirt for women to wear who were fashionable in the early 1900s. At the same time, these women who wore these shirts marked a symbol for being more progressive, more modern, trying to seek new privileges that would happen at home and at work. But the shirtwaist did not come to existence in a vacuum. Shirtwaist blouses were produced in a very competitive market in Philadelphia and in New York. In Manhattan alone, there are over 450 textile factories employing over 40,000 garment workers, many of them immigrants. At the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, located in the top floors in Greenwich Village, was one of the many shirtwaist factories operating in Manhattan at the time. The workers were primarily from Russia, Italy, Germany, and Hungary. Mothers and daughters, some as young as the age of 12, often worked side by side in unsafe working conditions. And they were paid very small piecemeal wages for days that were often 14 hours or more. So one of the things that you could do with this resource in your classroom is show this video and talk about the horrific working conditions that immigrant women faced as they worked to produce this really hot material commodity, and also to really show how these women went on their quest for better pay and working conditions through organized labor. So looking at the video and the advertisement resource as one of your primary source resources to look at material culture, you can use the uprising of 20,000, the New York Shirtwaist Workers go on strike in the classroom. So again, lots of different ways that we can start to engage students and how even what we wear on a daily basis can be used to look at issues of wealth, class, working conditions, and organized labor. And now I would love to turn it back over to Alicia, who's going to go through the rest of our slide presentation for the evening.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Oftentimes, we forget that material culture doesn't always just have to be artifacts that we bring to our students for examination within the confines of our four walls. We can always bring our students to artifacts with field trips. And I wanted to familiarize yourself with just this amazing book by Clint Smith. So Carolyn, we're actually going to go a couple of slides down. One more. All right, yep, right there, absolutely. And this amazing book is How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith. Please throw it in the chat if you had the pleasure of reading it. It is an amazing book, and it provides a great blueprint for educators looking to accomplish such a goal. Next slide. One area that lends itself well to this is the restoration of segregated cemeteries. Now, I have a lot of informational text on the upcoming slides that I'm just not going to be able to go over in detail for the sake of time. However, the recording of this presentation will be made available, so you'll be able to access that if you're so inclined to. But over 90% of America's cemeteries were segregated on some level up until the 1950s, believe it or not. But the interesting thing is that Black communities established their own cemeteries to be able to still provide loved ones with a respectable resting place, and was in many ways a show of resistance. Next slide. And such was the case with one of the oldest Black cemeteries in DC, where I teach, Mount Zion and Union Band Cemetery. It was established in 1808, and it was initially a resting place for both white and Black members of a church by the name of Montgomery Methodist Church. Not only was the cemetery a burial ground for free and enslaved Black people as well as whites, but it is believed that it was also used as a stop along the Underground Railroad right here in DC. Next slide. Well, in 1849, Oak Hill Cemetery was created right next to Mount Zion Cemetery. And soon whites stopped burying their loved ones in the Mount Zion Cemetery and prohibited Blacks from burying theirs in Oak Hill. So Oak Hill Cemetery was now created for white people to be able to bury their loved ones. They took the bodies out of Mount Zion that were white and they moved it to Oak Hill, and they prevented Black people from being able to bury theirs in Oak Hill Cemetery. So you can take a look at how beautiful Oak Hill Cemetery is today, and this is exactly what ended up happening to Mount Zion. Just through years of neglect, lack of funding, that is actually a photograph that I took of what Mount Zion looks like today. Well, when I introduced my students to the story, and like I said, I'm not originally from DC, I'm originally from Florida, but DC is now my home. And I wanted to make my students aware of the community and the history that they live in. My students immediately wanted to do something about it. So I tried to apply for as many grants as I could. I, got donations, money from the department. I got donations from individual teachers outside of the department and their families who found out that our students wanted to do something collectively about it and wanted to donate money. And we were able to gather up enough money to, get a bus to take us to Mount Zion, purchase a bench, and we purchased a plaque, which the engravement of with the promise to always remember. Next slide, please. And we had our STEM girls. I loved it, particularly because STEM is an area where girls are so underrepresented. But my girls stepped up and said, "Hey, we want to put together the bench." And we had a teacher that helped to volunteer to help embed the plaque right in the middle of the bench. Next slide. And then we went out to the cemetery. We picked up trash. We cleaned up the brush. We actually led a ceremony before we even got started, where our students all wore white, and we dedicated our labor and our bench to the community and those who were laid to rest there. The students engaged in headstone rubbings. And one of the things I loved about it is not only were they servicing their community, history was becoming real. And once again, they were becoming actors, and they were able to touch the headstones. They were able to actually feel history. This was material culture, kind of at its best. Next slide. So that's just one idea of an activity that you could do in your classroom. And like I said, you have the segregated cemeteries that are all over the country, not just in the South, but in the North as well. But lastly, an additional example of what you can do in your classroom to make material culture come alive without just being confined to artifacts that you bring into the classroom is by having students conduct an oral history project, something that we all do. One of the ones I love doing is having my students go out and interview and record on their iPhones or their computers someone in their community who survived the 1968 riots after Dr. King was assassinated, and being able to preserve that history in a community that's quickly being gentrified. But one of the ways you can elevate the activity and bring in material culture is when you have your students do these oral history activities, whoever they are interviewing, ask the students to ask the people they're interviewing to bring in an artifact or an heirloom from that era that they're going to be talking about, and use that as the center of their story or serve as a talking piece. So once again, bringing in material culture, not necessarily the students bringing it to us or going out and finding it, and not necessarily us having to bring it to them. Next slide. So we really appreciate you all signing up and hanging with us during this presentation. We would love your feedback. If you would be so kind, please let us know maybe one major takeaway from tonight's webinar. You can throw it in the chat. We definitely do read these, and we take these to heart, and we use these in creating our future webinars. And Carolyn, I'm going to pass it back over to you.
And I'm going to wind down and give a very sincere and huge thank you to Dr. Tiya Miles and to all of the social studies team and to everyone who was on the webinar. You will have these slides, and so I'm just going to quickly go through that there are, we mentioned this is the fourth in a series of 4 webinars, and each one is pictured on a slide, and you will have the links to the recordings for each of them. We are going to be hosting a webinar next Wednesday on using Frontline resources in the classroom. We have a team member from Frontline and a teacher. And so if you're interested in that, please register for that or sign up for the sign up and you'll get the recording. Ashante is with us from NCSS, and she wants to extend an invitation to attend the conference in December. Ashante, if you're still here with us. Maybe not. Maybe she needed to go. All right, we're going to be at NCSS in Philadelphia with bells and whistles. We'll be in the exhibit hall. We have multiple sessions, and we hope to meet many of you there. Take a snapshot of this if you would like. This is the survey for the webinar. You can download a certificate after taking the survey. I'm sure Denise is posting the link in the chat also. And actually, when you close out of this browser, the survey should pop up. There's the link to that resource document we've mentioned, and you'll get these links in the follow-up email tomorrow also. And then a classroom handout that the social studies team created that is very, very useful. And that's another resource that we would like to share with you. Okay, thank you so much to everyone. I'm sorry we're a little over time. We don't have time for more questions. We will get back to some of you individually, and you're always welcome to email me and I'll get you to the right person on the team. Thank you again. If any of the presenters who are still in the room, if you'd like to come back on camera. And again, thank you very, very much. We'll keep the chat open for a couple of minutes. We do get a big kick out of reading your responses. So feel free to post something, and then we'll hope to see you soon in another webinar. Thank you.